All right, it's about time for us to get started with our class this morning. We're going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, continuing our study of this section of 8 through 10. Really looking forward to some of the stuff that we're going to talk about this morning. Before we dig into that, let's bow and go to God in prayer. Father, we are grateful for today. We're grateful for the time that we have to spend with you and to spend with each other. We're grateful for your word that you have provided us to guide us nearer to you. Pray that you would bless us as we study this morning, that you would help us to have hearts that are open and receptive to your word, that we would lay aside the things that we need to change about ourselves and to seek to draw near to you, to seek to be transformed by you, and to seek to follow you in spirit and in truth. We ask all this in Jesus' most holy name. Amen. All right. Feels like a little bit of a thinner crowd this morning. I don't know if that's just me or if there's just, people coming in still. But in any case, a good opportunity for us to all participate. Please don't leave me high and dry on your comments. You guys always do a great job. To recap where we've been so far, we are about halfway through the book of 1 Corinthians. 1 through 4, Paul is addressing a lot of the divisions that are going on and the issues that are going basically around the arrogance of the Corinthians and kind of them pursuing a gospel that's about self-exaltation. It's not explicitly mentioned in the text, but we know kind of from piecing stuff together from this and from 2 Corinthians that it seems like there's some guys who are basically false preachers who are very talented speakers, very eloquent, very charming, and are presenting, biblical ideas or scriptural ideas, presenting the gospel, but in ways that are really about glorifying themselves, accumulating followers for themselves, probably making some money. And so the influence of these guys has really harmed the Corinthian church. And so in chapters 1 through 4, Paul is trying to address some of that. In 5 through 6, he'll kind of segue into specific issues that they were having. And now at this point, he's started to address some of the specific questions that they had written to him about before. And so in chapter 8, we introduced this idea of eating food sacrificed to idols, which is not really something that is common in our culture today, but basically it's the idea that they're living in this Gentile culture, and so it's very common for the, Gentile folks that they live around who are not Christians to be sacrificing food to idols, and that food is also stuff that they would eat, and you would maybe be able to buy that in the meat market, or you would potentially go to the temple and be able to eat there like it's a restaurant almost, I don't know. But basically, there's food that's been sacrificed to false gods that's available to be eaten. And some of the Christians say, well, we know that it's fine for us to eat this because we know that the idol is just an object. It's not a real God and we're not worshiping it. And there are some people who used to actually worship idols who feel like when they are partaking in that, they're participating in that same worship that they were doing before. And so there's some conflict around, well, how do we deal with this? Because the people who want to eat the food that was sacrificed to idols are apparently frustrated with people who don't want to eat that seems to be getting in the way of what they want to do. And so they've written to Paul, it seems like, to try and clear that issue up. And Paul kind of takes a step back and says, this isn't really about the issue of just like, is it okay to eat this food or not? The issue is more about how are you approaching your brother and their conscience about what's right and wrong, and are you seeking the best interest of your brother and their soul? And so in chapter 8, he kind of outlines that, it may be okay to eat the food sacrificed to idols if you understand that that is not really, an idol, that it's just an object and it's just food. And he'll get into some of the more specifics of that in chapter 10. In chapter 8, he kind of outlines you need to recognize that by doing that, you might be encouraging your brother who has an issue with that to do something that they feel is sinful. And for them to do something that they feel is sinful, even if on paper it's not, it's still sin because in their heart they're making a choice to do something they feel is wrong. And so Paul is starting to introduce the idea of it is better for you to adjust your behavior to accommodate the needs of your brother than it is for you to pursue exactly what you want. And so that's what we're going to get into in chapter 9. So I'd like to start off, we're going to read a pretty big section here to start. We'll read chapter 9, verses 1 through 14. Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are not you my workmanship in the Lord? If to others I am not an apostle, at least I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. This is my defense to those who would examine me. Do we not have the right to eat and drink? Do we not have the right to take along a believing wife, as do the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas? Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working for a living? Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard without eating any of its fruit? Or who tends a flock without getting some of the milk? Do I say these things on human authority? Does not the law say the same? For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain. Is it for oxen that God is concerned? Does he not certainly speak for our sake? It was written for our sake, because the plowman should plow in hope, and the thresher thresh in hope of sharing in the crop. If we have sown spiritual things among you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? If others share this rightful claim on you, do not we even more? Nevertheless, we have not made use of this right, but we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. Do you not know that those who are employed in the temple service get their food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar share in the sacrificial offerings? In the same way, the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. All right, so maybe a good place to start is, why is Paul talking about this in relation to this question of food sacrificed to idols? How does this section relate to his broader argument or the broader point he's trying to make? Yeah, Wayne.
It's just about freedom, about God giving us the freedom to make a living, to live lives that don't violate our conscience. We can do a lot of things. The scripture is not as restrictive as people would think it would be meant. It's not don't do this, don't do this. We have great freedom.
Sure. Okay, so there's a component here of Paul's illustrating that in what he's trying to describe here, he's not necessarily just trying to put arbitrary limitations on them. And there's not, Christianity is not about like just kind of restricting yourself into being a monk or something like that. What else? How does this relate to the argument that he's trying to make? Yeah.
In verse 12, he basically shows himself, the other apostles, as far as in the same situation as those he's speaking to, shows the heart of, yes, I have the freedom to do other things like pursue a life, pursue a living, but I endure for the sake of others, for the sake of you, showing the same idea that even though he has the freedom to do something, he also is willing to endure for the sake of others, for the soul of others as well.
Yeah, so he's basically illustrating, I have a right to do things like, receive payment for spreading the gospel in my work as an evangelist. I have a right to be married if I want to be married, and I think the implication there is I have a right to enough income from the gospel that not only I'm supporting myself, but I'm also able to support a wife and a family. I have a right to accept those things. It wouldn't be wrong for me to do that, and there are other apostles who receive payment for being an apostle and spreading the gospel and that kind of thing. But he says, I've given up that right basically so that it will benefit other people, in this case, the Corinthians, for him to give that up. And so he's drawing a parallel between what he's asking them to do, which is give up their right to eat food sacrificed to idols for the sake of their brethren. What else do you all see in this section? Yeah.
There's the aspect that he's putting the proof is in the pudding, basically. So he just said, I'm willing to do this vis-a-vis the meat and sacrifice, not eating meat ever again, if that was what it would take to not call somebody to suffer. Which, if somebody were to be cynical, they could say, oh, it's easy to say that. But then he takes it to the next level. In this section, it says, not only would I do that, but I'm doing even more. I am not doing this right now, actively not taking payment from you or anyone. I'm having Barnabas and I are working to support ourselves so that we don't impose on you. So he's really just saying, he's putting even more emphasis, and I never really quite thought about it until this morning, on the fact of what he just said he would do by showing what he already is doing, which is like 10 times harder than what he already said he would do. So.
Yeah, I love that. He's made a pretty big claim at the end of chapter 8 that, like, if it was necessary, he would become a vegetarian. That doesn't really appeal to me, but like, that's a pretty big commitment. And that's like kind of an abstract concept because he's talking about this specific situation and he's kind of using a hypothetical. But then he goes on to use this specific example of, hey, these actually are some of the rights that I really have given up for the sake of the gospel. So he's backing up the fact that he is committed to this based around what he's actually done. And he's also, I think, emphasizing, to your point, that he's not really asking them to do something that he himself wouldn't be willing to do. He's really asking far less of them. What else?
Plus, he's kind of explaining that it's okay. It's okay for you to pay me. You know what I'm saying? He's like, it's okay, but if you don't, I will go without.
Yeah. So maybe that's a sidebar that we can have of, Paul spends a lot of time making this point of, it's fine for me to receive payment for my work, basically, but I've decided not to. And you can kind of imagine he could maybe make that point in 5 verses and kind of get his point across. Why does he spend 14 verses talking about this? Wayne?
When he gives the warning to the Ephesian elders that among you, the eldership, there will be people who arise that actually put these limitations on. They will forbid to marry. That's kind of pointing toward, the coming of the Catholic Church, that kind of thing. But, it's going to be a danger for a long time, for centuries, that people want to put restrictions on Christians to increase their power, essentially, to make their position better. Limiting the personal freedom of people is how you control them.
Gotcha. Okay, so maybe he's anticipating that there would be future objections to say, receiving payment as an evangelist or something like that. And so he's also taking the time to kind of lay this out now to kind of clear that up. What else might be going on? Yeah.
This is what you're getting at, but I think he's showing us the heart of Jesus, that you sacrifice what you have, you rightfully have. Jesus did that. He made himself poor when he was rich, and he came here. He sacrificed for our sake. And Paul is saying, you do whatever it takes to sacrifice for the soul of your brother or sister where you can. It reminds me of Romans 9, where he says, I have great sorrow and unceasing anguish in my heart, for I could wish that I myself were cursed and cut off from Christ for the benefit of my brothers and sisters, my own flesh and blood, concerning about the Jews, and how desperately he wanted them to be saved. So much, not literally that he would give up his own salvation. That's not what happened, but that's how deeply he loved his brothers and sisters, and he's trying to hold his group of Christians together in love and in equality.
Yeah, so he's giving them a very vivid demonstration of the kind of thing that he's talking about, the kind of behavior that he is, I guess, trying to stir up in them. Any other thoughts about what might be going on here? Yeah.
Kind of going on with that, so in verse 12, we have not made use of this right. He proves how he has the knowledge that he talks about in chapter 8. But the knowledge isn't really important. He doesn't say to argue about it. He doesn't even say to teach them how they are wrong. He says, I don't have to do that. Like, love these people where they are, and maybe you can get to that point where you can teach them, but the knowledge doesn't matter if they're innocent.
Yeah, so he's unconcerned about having the right, like, factual answer if it's going to be not constructive for the actual love and upbuilding of his brethren. Yeah. What else? Yeah, Josh.
I love that in verse 7 he uses examples of like, do you plant a vineyard and then nobody gets the fruit of that vineyard? You're supposed to enjoy the fruit of that vineyard. And then he also talks about flock and getting meat and milk from that flock. So he's using the examples of like, since I planted the gospel here, I should be getting payment for it, but I'm giving that up to benefit you to grow more.
Yeah.
The church.
Yeah, he's basically using like a common sense argument there, right? If you can look at other areas of life, and it makes sense that if you're investing effort into something, you're going to expect to get something back from that. I think part of the reason why he spends so much time talking about this, the primary point he's trying to get across, and we've talked about it a lot, is the I think level of commitment and the level of sacrifice that Christians need to be willing to put forth, I guess, to benefit their brothers and to basically allow their brethren to grow and to flourish. And if that means giving up significant things, go for it. Like, that is the better path. What also is going on, and this maybe we don't pick up as much in this text, is Paul's trying to address a little bit some of the accusations that have been leveled against him by some of these false preachers. And this is something I talked about with Barry, so hopefully I'll explain it correctly. But kind of what's going on is these guys basically make their money off of being very eloquent. And in 2 Corinthians, we'll kind of hear some of their complaints about him of, like, Paul isn't really like that impressive of a speaker. Like, he's not really a great orator. He's like not really good looking. He's not particularly like well spoken. He writes really well, but when it comes to standing up and speaking, like, why would he, why would you want to pay that guy? We're better than him. And so he's kind of trying to address some of the accusations that are against him, because part of what they will accuse him of is, well, he's going to act like he doesn't want money from you directly, but then he'll say, take up a collection, and like that money's going to kind of wind its way back into his pocket anyway. And so basically the criticism from some of these false preachers is, Paul isn't really worth your money, but he's going to try and kind of be a grifter and get his hands onto it. And what Paul's trying to illustrate here is, secondarily, I have the right to receive payment from you guys directly if I wanted to ask for that. Like, it would be justified for me to just ask for that directly. And he's saying, I have not accepted that because that's not my priority. And so I think there's a implication here of creating a distinction between his approach and, once again, the approach of the false preachers, humility and self-sacrifice versus self-exaltation and pride. Any other thoughts on chapter or verses 9 through 14? Yeah.
Just going back to the beginning, it seems like they're questioning his apostleship and why and whether he is actually an apostle. So that he has to lay it out for them.
Yeah, there's basically people who are talking smack about Paul, and one of the things he's trying to do is defend his authority, not for his own ego, but so that his credibility as an apostle allows him to continue to teach them the truth. All right, let's pick up in verse 15, and we'll go 15 through 18. But I have made no use of any of these rights, nor am I writing these things to secure any such provision. For I would rather die than have anyone deprive me of my ground for boasting. For if I preach the gospel, that gives me no ground for boasting, for necessity is laid upon me. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. For if I do this of my own will, I have a reward, but if not of my own will, I am still entrusted with a stewardship. What then is my reward? That in my preaching I may present the gospel free of charge, so as not to make full use of my right in the gospel. All right, what things stick out to you in this section? Yeah, Wayne.
I think of the reflection he is of Christ, and how Christ gave up so much, and he did too. When it says, I became all things to all people, we don't often think about that being poor, destitute, beaten, being of no repute, in fact, being of ill repute for preaching the gospel. But he thinks the very most important thing in his life, everything just pales compared to the gospel message of Christ.
Yeah, his number one priority is sharing the gospel with people and helping others come to Christ. What else sticks out? Yeah, Brian.
I think it's a perfect defense of what you just hit on. He just went through explaining how he has all these rights, but yet he's not exercising them. So they don't become gospel. And he's taking it a step further, saying, I can do all these things and make life easier on myself, but I'm not for the advancement of the gospel. And I'm not doing these things that don't become gospel to someone, whether it's those who are listening, we'll see as we go further down, how he is changing himself in different settings to reach other people, how he's giving up certain ways, certain rights to again for the complete advancement of the gospel. And what he is sacrificing is all in for Christ.
Yeah. So he's basically spends the first half of this chapter saying, these are all the rights that I've given up. And now he's saying, and the reason that I've given up these rights is because I'm all in on sharing the gospel with people. And so if I have to give up these rights to be more effective at that, I'll do it, because that is of greater value to me than, I guess, receiving payment or whatever. Yeah, what else? Yeah.
I think we're missing the point of what he's talking about is support for preachers. What he's saying here is these other people aren't getting support. They deserve it. They need it. Give it to them. I don't need it. Remember, Paul came from a history of rich. He's got money behind him. He's got all kinds of things that the other people we know of, the fishermen, didn't have, because they gave up their things in order to do this.
Yeah, certainly I think he's going to loop back to that. We probably won't get to that in this class, but when he gets into 1 Corinthians 16, he'll kind of loop back to that of encouraging them to send support to other areas. And it seems like part of the problem that they're having is they're supporting preachers, but the preachers that they're supporting are not particularly invested in really teaching the gospel. They're preachers who are invested in kind of exalting themselves. And so Paul is making, I think, a case that the preachers that they should be investing in should be people like himself who are willing to make the sacrifices necessary to share the gospel, because those are the people who really care about saving souls, whereas the guys that seem to be getting their money right now are the guys who are about, well, let me get up and talk and sound good, and I'll basically get paid as an orator because I can already talk really well. If I just talk about God, then these Christians will pay me for that. And that's not really the kind of attitude that Paul is trying to demonstrate here. I think it's kind of a different, an opposite perspective. What else?
What he's really trying to say is support these preachers that need support.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah. What else? Yeah.
We never thought about this before, but he talks about the gospel as being part of our stewardship. And I think when we think about stewardship, we think about material things, being wise with our money, things like that. But he talks about being wise with how we hear the gospel and our stewardship with that. And I don't know what that.
Yeah, that's a great point of you take better care of something when you're, I guess, a steward. Like if you borrow somebody's car or whatever, you take better care of that thing than if it was your own thing, because you know that that person has entrusted you with something that is theirs. And to that point, God has entrusted us with the gospel message and with the mission of sharing that with other people. And that's a responsibility that we need to take really seriously, as if we were the same way as if we were a steward of something else physical that somebody had entrusted us with. We would take really good care of that. The care that we take in how we share the gospel needs to be manifested in our behavior, in our actions, because the gospel message, I think, to your point, while it's not a physical object, is something that can be marred by not taking care of it well. And I think that's kind of what is potentially going on with this issue, that the broader issue of food sacrifice to idols that Paul is addressing here, of when these Christians are doing things that are compromising the conscience of their brethren, that is not good stewardship of the gospel message. Here's the one thing I kind of want to pull out of here. What is the deal with the boasting? Does that strike anybody else as strange or confusing or?
Yeah, because he tells us, we shouldn't boast, but he's asking why I want to boast. But then in verse 16, it says, I have no grounds of boasting. It's like a conflict. He wants, I don't understand. I was just going to ask.
Yeah. Josh, what do you got?
Well, since we're talking about the false teachers who are like, hey, look at me, I can say these eloquent words. They're like boasting that they can say the eloquent words well and get the gospel out. And Paul's like, no, you just need to speak simply.
Yeah. He's kind of, I think, taking a shot at these false preachers and trying to kind of illustrate how their attitude is incorrect. Any other thoughts on what's going on with the boasting? Yeah, John.
You see it throughout his writing where he again and again comes back to he himself is nothing and he boasts in Christ. And I think he's just reinforcing that here by saying, tying it back into the recompense conversation as well, saying, even if no one in the world pays me, I have to do this. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. If I don't preach the gospel, it gives me if that is the one thing that he boasts in is in Christ, and he feels that he would rather, he even says in previous, I would rather die than have anyone deprive me of my grounds for boasting, which is being a servant of Christ. So he is saying in stark contrast how vastly more important this is to him to preach the word of the gospel, and you can see it in inference versus the other people that are doing a commodity game. And he just says, I would rather die than not be able to do this. Forget money, forget support, forget anything. This is why I'm here. If I couldn't do this, kill me, basically.
Yeah. I don't think Paul is saying that he's literally going around boasting like, oh man, I am a great evangelist, I'm a great apostle, look at how many people I have converted and all that kind of stuff. Although arguably Paul had major impact, right? So he could probably say a lot of that stuff and have it just be factual. I think what he's driving at here is, I think he's also being a little bit sarcastic and kind of trying to expose the false preachers, because he's basically saying, well, like if I'm just preaching the gospel for money, like I have to preach the gospel, like there's no street cred from me just doing my job. So he's like, I'm got to share it for free if I want to have any sort of real grounds for boasting. I've got to be able to share it for free if I really want to be able to say I'm a great preacher. And Paul's concern isn't actually with his own ego, but he's kind of flipping the hierarchy or the status structure of these false preachers on his head, because he's saying, hey, if you want to be a high status preacher, the most impressive thing you could do as a preacher is preach for free, is do it and not be about the money. And so what he was trying to say is, these preachers who are boasting in themselves are boasting because it seems like partly they're like, look how much money I'm making. Look how valuable I am. Look how much I get paid because of how good I am as a preacher. And we can even see that today. There's like celebrity preachers, right? And people who make a ton of money off of accumulating a following and a celebrity, I guess, persona. And what Paul is basically illustrating is, if you really want to have something to brag about, be somebody who shares the gospel for free. Be somebody who does it not for the money. And I don't think he's talking about boasting literally, but he's trying to expose the fact that these false preachers are boasting in things other than Christ. Jerry.
Well, he's been trying to relate to them, to speak to them in a way they understand. So saying the boasting piece helps them see that. They've been confused anyway. It was oh, well, I understand the scripture better, so I know I can do this. When next level is not treating people poorly because of it.
Yeah. All right, let's jump into 19 through 23. For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. To the Jews I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessings. All right, what jumps out in this next section? Yeah.
Seems verse 19 that, like it said, Paul's not preaching to make money. He's preaching to win souls to Christ. And that should always be the goal of anyone who's preaching or teaching the word. And I think that was lost here, and I think it's lost today. Success is defined by how many people are in your congregation and how much money are you bringing in because of your preaching that month. And winning souls to Christ is kind of second or fourth down the list of importance.
Yeah, so his priority is just like, did I share the gospel? Chad, do you have a comment?
Jacob, that's a great comment. I wonder how Paul would be accepted in congregations today. I've heard many times, we'd like to hire somebody like the Apostle Paul. I don't think many places would.
Yeah.
Paul's heart is what we look at here. Paul's motivation was the cross. It wasn't money. It wasn't fame. I've known some evangelists in the past that go into a congregation, I need 102.6, and this baby cakes, this and that. Evangelists are to be paid. We pay them to do this on a full-time basis. But the goal is not to build themselves up. Our goal is not to build ourselves up, it's to build up Christ. And we're very blessed to have an evangelist here that understands that. We should never take that for granted.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, Wayne.
When we had the guy in that was talking about preaching in India, it's a delicate balancing act between having more money than everybody else around, where they will look at you and that stands as a barrier. The money they're making from preaching the gospel stands as a barrier, because they were saying even though they're very poor, they help all these children. They give liberally of the meager income they have. But as elders, you've got to really be mindful of that delicate balance in their situation. That is something that is really hard for me to determine how much is too much in a certain situation. And then I've been in congregations where in men's meetings they've actually said the preacher should not make more money than the median income in the congregation, which I don't know where that comes from either. You know, it's just crazy.
Yeah.
Limiting can be, you can muzzle the ox at a certain point. They can eat a little, but they can't eat too much.
Yeah, that's true. What maybe are like, because I think this is a good section to kind of transition into applications for us as well, because none of us are Paul. I don't think any of us are like full-time evangelists, unless we have somebody visiting. But we're all trying to share the gospel. So how does this section apply to us, Jerry?
Nicole had some.
Okay, Nicole.
So, sorry, I'm just trying to connect my comment to what you said now.
Well, just make your comment.
So, I think also part of this is about flipping how the preachers reacted, like you said earlier, about they were trying to be better and make money, and that was the reason he says. This is another way Paul's turning that on his head. He's saying, I'm not coming to you saying I'm better than you. He's saying, like, I'm not here to save you because I was better. I was lost also. I was here. I'm here with you. Let's look to God together. Like, I don't know, just thinking about it. Like, they were looking like, I'm better. You need me to help save you.
Yeah.
Paul, this is empathy, right? He's saying, I'm going to meet you where you're at. We're going to look to God together, because sometimes it's better to be broken and to be inconvenienced and to look weak, if that's going to save someone, rather than looking like we are better or have more.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think that's relevant to the question I asked of, it's going to be difficult to share the gospel if you are constantly placing yourself on a pedestal above the person that you're trying to share the gospel with.
I was thinking about how it kind of contrasts with chapter 7, the section in chapter 7 where it says to live as you're called. Live as you're called. Like if you were circumcised when you came into the gospel, don't try to remove that. If you weren't circumcised, don't try to add that. And how this is kind of contrasting, like saying I'm becoming all things to all people. And I was trying to kind of marry those two things together. They seem like they're different, but I think it's the difference in who he's talking to, maybe.
Yeah.
Because he was telling people, you don't have to become all these other things. You just need to go. You just need to go into Christ to become. Your salvation is not based on any of those things. I think is what he was saying in chapter 7, versus in chapter 9. He's saying, but you might have to, give up certain things to become something different if you want to promote the gospel. And we're going to talk to that.
Yeah, no, I think you're spot on. In chapter 7, he's really talking about, hey, like, you don't have to modify yourself in worldly ways in order to be worthy of the gospel. Whether you're a husband or a wife, or you're single, or you're circumcised or uncircumcised or whatever, like, it doesn't really matter. Just be content with the life that God has assigned to you, and don't be preoccupied with changing yourself in some sort of way to somehow increase your value in God's eyes or something like that. Whereas here, I think what he's saying is not that you literally need to change, right? Like, Paul couldn't literally transform into a Gentile, but what he's going to do when he's talking to a Gentile versus a Jew is he's going to approach it from the sensibilities of a Gentile and their culture and the things that they're going to be concerned about. He's going to be accommodating to where they're at and in relation to the gospel. Whereas if he's talking to a Jew, that's going to be very different, right? Paul might be going out to Edley's barbecue with a Gentile, probably not going to do that with a Jew, right? He's not going to go out with his Pharisee bros and go eat some bacon, right? So that's like kind of a silly example, but he's talking about really trying to modulate your behavior and modulate your heart towards somebody so that you can accommodate wherever they're at for the sake of the gospel. Any other thoughts on this section? Yeah, Josh.
It's kind of, this section is let your light shine, is what I see it as.
Yeah.
So you just help people get along so that they'll be like, oh, and it'll be easier for them to understand for Christ. Because Paul had Timothy circumcised, so Timothy could preach to the Jews. Because the Jews would look inferior, they would look down on Timothy for not being circumcised. So Paul had him circumcised so the Jews would listen to Timothy's words.
Yeah, I love that. And that's like the ultimate example of like the commitment to this is, that's, Barry said that's how far Paul would go. And I said that's how far Timothy would go. Let's get into verses 24 through 27. I want to wrap this up while we have a couple more minutes. Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. So I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. So what is Paul's point in this last section? What is this metaphor about? Yeah.
It kind of just wraps up what it's all about to this point is remembering that we have to keep our eye on the prize, as it were, to continue to seek towards the prize, and then what is that reward that we should be ultimately seeking, which is to bring others to the gospel.
Yeah.
And to make sure that along the way, we don't forget about our own souls. And he's reminding, like, when you're empathetic to others, when you're looking at others and what their needs are, when you decide how you're going to approach somebody, whether you're going to use a freedom or not use a freedom that you have, are you keeping your eye on the prize, the ultimate prize? Are you keeping that in mind when you are making those decisions and making those interactions with others and yourself?
Yeah, eye on the prize. I love that. A few years ago, I read, it was a professional athlete who had been completely dominant in his sport, and he had decided to retire basically at the top of his game because he was like, I've beaten everybody, I'm going to go out on top. And he was kind of talking about, like, it's also really stressful to maintain this level of excellence. And he was talking a little bit in this, like, article that he had written about why he was retiring, about some of the sacrifices that he had made to be able to win year over year. And one of the things he said that struck me, I don't know if I'll ever forget this, but he said, like, as it would get closer to the time for the championship, it was like I would stop using, like, steak knives or anything sharp to cut my food for fear that I would accidentally cut myself and I would injure my hand, I wouldn't be able to compete. And I was like, that is kind of insane. Like, that you're so afraid, you're so focused on achieving your goal that you're like, I'm not even going to touch a steak knife just on the off chance that I might injure my hand too badly to compete. And I think that's what Paul is talking about is, if you ever have seen, like, the mindset of a professional athlete and how dialed in they are in every aspect of their life to achieve their goal of winning whatever championship they want to achieve, I think that's kind of the mindset that Paul is talking about, that Christians need to have their eye on the prize and be that dialed in on serving God and every other aspect of my life. Whatever sacrifices I have to make, that means I have to stop using steak knives. That's the sacrifice we make because we are dialed in on finishing the race. That's all I got for you this morning. Appreciate your comments. We have, I think, one more week of this, and then Barry will kind of be figuring out how to wrap up the rest of 1 Corinthians. So, thank you.